I'm going to weave 4 stories through my talk this evening. And there are 4 stories that start with a very terrible beginning. Back in the early 2000s, the city of Baltimore had a school readiness rate of 28%. Now think about that for a minute. In Baltimore, 5-year-olds were showing up at kindergarten and they take a school readiness test. 28% of them were considered to be school ready. That's a terrible fact number 1. We heard a bit from Faye about the juvenile justice system. In the 90s, this juvenile justice system began to spin out of control, locking up more and more and more young people in response to a perceived epidemic of super predators who were coming their way. Now, I was able to identify only 4 super predators. They all lived with me. They all ended up graduating high school and college. But other than them, I don't think I've ever met a super predator, and yet we built cell after cell after cell after cell in the 90s. A third terrible story you can visualize if you've ever seen the HBO show The Wire. Now, for those who have watched that show and paid any attention to it, you know that it was set, the plot was set mostly in West Baltimore, but it was filmed in East Baltimore. And the reason for that is East Baltimore had more vacancies, more lousy-looking properties than West Baltimore. So they filmed it in East Baltimore. And East Baltimore was a place that had 70%, in the one neighborhood in East Baltimore, 70% of the properties were either vacant or abandoned. Terrible school results for the children, crime, drugs, all the usual things that go with a community that has been systematically disinvested over a course of 30 years. That's the third bad story. And the fourth also goes back probably a lot more than 30 years, which is that if you look at the outcomes for children in the city of Baltimore from the time they're born till the time they don't get a job, they are uniformly terrible. So these are the 4 stories that I'm going to use to kind of weave through what will be, frankly, a little bit of a dense presentation of lessons learned by Casey and others over the years as we've done this kind of collective impact work. So again, the frame for this is a collective impact frame, starting with the notion that you've got to be clear on what population you're working with and define population level results, right? So that's kind of the core here. What are the population level results you're trying to get? Not program results, population level results. You're trying to change things for all those children in Baltimore. You're trying to change school readiness for every child who shows up at kindergarten. You're trying to change the trajectory for young people who get involved with the juvenile justice system, and you're trying to change all of that neighborhood in East Baltimore. It also, in all of these stories, we work to bring together key decision makers who either influenced or directly controlled the resources that would be necessary in order to make the kinds of changes that we wanted to see. We got those key decision makers to commit to aligning their contributions, aligning what they did, so we tried to change the outcomes that we were looking at. And very importantly, again, as Faye said, the notion was to build capacity not only for the purpose of solving the problem that was right in front of us, but to have leave behind capacity as we go forward, and a particular kind of leave behind capacity. Number 1, we wanted to see a different kind of leadership capacity, not just the leadership that focuses toward one's own organization, but actually leadership that can be shared across multiple organizations. We wanted to build the capacity to use data to drive decisions. We wanted to build the capacity to respond as you learn things and as the environment changes. So we wanted to build capacity to constantly adapt over time. We wanted to see capacity to use a results-based accountability frame so that people would hold each other accountable based on the results that the collective was attaining. And very importantly, we wanted to build capacity for people to be able to not just talk about race and culture and class and power, but actually to, in a meaningful way, bring that into the work to inform what we focus on, what we do, and why we do it. So those are the capacities that we wanted to leave behind. So I want to talk now about lessons learned from a funder's perspective, and I want to use kind of the stages that Faye talked about a moment ago that each of you said you were in, sort of the early initiation stage, what I call the let's put on a show stage, right? Somebody says, pulls a few folks together and says, school readiness is terrible, we ought to do something about it, to the startup phase, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on that because that's where a lot of the work is, to the early taking action, you're taking steps now, you're moving from talking to actually doing something, and to the mature initiatives, using, again, these 4 stories, all of which have a slightly different spin on that. So that's the bulk of what I'm going to talk about this evening. So from a funder's perspective, I think there are 3 basic questions that we all ought to get clear about when we get involved in this collective impact work. One is, how do you know if you're on the right track? So you're a funder, you've got some responsibility for the money that you're spending, the time you're putting in. How do you know if you're on the right track? What are the right ingredients in the potluck that makes up collective impact? So that's like the first question. The second question is, what do you bring as a funder? What do funders bring to that potluck? What's the contribution that funders ought to be making at each of those stages? And finally, what should you be worried about? What are the risks? What are the things at each stage that you ought to be paying attention to, because you know if they start to go south, you've got a big problem. So let's start with the first stage, that kind of let's put on a show, let's have a conversation, gee, we've got a problem, maybe we should do something about it. And this is the time when you start to ask the question of what's going to bring people to the table. And there's a very technical term from management that answers that question, and it's called a big, hairy, audacious goal. You got to have a big goal, right? That brings people to the table. A goal that's big enough and important enough that, in fact, it's going to be worth all the time and money you're going to put into it, and yet not so lofty that it's kind of meaningless and nobody has any sense that you'd ever achieve it. It needs to be a focused goal. It needs to be a goal that people have a sense of urgency about. So in the case of kids showing up at school not ready to learn, that was a pretty straightforward one. A big goal was to have every child who shows up in kindergarten in Baltimore ready to learn. In the case of the juvenile justice system, the big goal was to stop the addiction this country was growing to incarceration, stop the epidemic of incarceration of juveniles that we were seeing. In the case of East Baltimore, it was to revitalize an entire community so that families would be better off after the initiative than before. And in the case of the terrible outcomes at each step of the developmental cycle that we saw for all the children in Baltimore, a kind of cradle-to-career improvement in the outcomes that those children would be achieving. So then we move to the question of, so who ought you bring to the table in this early kind of stage? This is a really, really important question. Again, you've got to start with the folks who've got the power. You've got to start with the folks who control resources, who influence decisions. You've got to start with them because you're not going to get very far if you're trying to change them if they're not at the table. You've got to start with folks who have, again, those resources, but resources is not only about money. It's not only about funds. And it's not only about formal decision-making power. We know for a fact that we're not going to be very successful in any community if we don't bring the community residents and the community organizations and the faith community in that community to the table. That's also a kind of resource that has to be at the table. So that's an important lesson to keep in mind. Another lesson, you ever get a last-minute invite to a party? Like you knew about the party, you knew who was invited. It's like, 4 o'clock on Saturday, the party's starting at 6, your phone rings, and so, we're having like a get-together, and you knew it was planned for months, right? You don't go into that party like all happy, right? It's really important this early stage to think very carefully about who needs to be at the table, because you don't want to leave out the wrong person. So in the case of the school readiness example in Baltimore, we actually did something a little bit unusual. We got commitment from the heads of all the agencies that touch children from birth through age 5, the public system agencies, the nonprofits. We got commitment to them to have us work on it, but we actually invited the middle managers from all of those organizations, because we were trying to do two things at once. We were trying to build leadership at the middle that's going to be there for a long time, as well as make a difference in this particular outcome. So that's who we invited to the table. In the case of juvenile justice, we invited the same list of folks that Faye called out: the courts, the probation officers, law enforcement, the prosecutors, the public defenders, et cetera, had to be at the table. In the case of East Baltimore, this was going to be a huge, huge project. We selected a geographic area that was 88 acres. As I said, 70% vacancy rate, right next to Johns Hopkins Medical Center. So next to one of the top hospitals and schools of public health in the entire world was this really poor, really disinvested community. So the table that came together included Hopkins, included the city, included the state, included developers, included the business sector, included banks, all had to be at the table for that particular approach. And in the case of the cradle to career work, which is it's very early, we've just begun it, we've just begun to set the table. We have the mayor, we have the school superintendent, we have the city health department, the state health department, we have the 5 largest foundations in the city, we have United Way, we have the Community Foundation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The somewhat usual suspects, if you will, that seem to come together on these cradle to career efforts. So what are some of the things you ought to worry about in this early stage? One is that you move too quickly, the whole table moves too quickly to kind of a high-level vision, and nobody pushes very hard about what that really means. And here's one of the many, many places that issues of race and class and power start to emerge. This is going to be a shock to everybody I know, but this is not a country that is comfortable talking about race and talking about class and talking about power. So we try to sort of keep it to a comfortable level, right? We sort of get to the place where if a few people are nodding their heads, it's like, let's move on to the next agenda. The trouble is that that's where you get stuck. In this particular conversation, you're going to have a ton of problems later on. Let me give you an example. In the East Baltimore Initiative, there were 3 agreements that everybody nodded their heads to. One was that every family who lived in the, currently, at the time, lived in the neighborhood would be better off after the initiative than they were before. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Everybody nodded their heads. Second was that when we were done, the neighborhood would be a mixed income neighborhood. Everybody nodded their heads. And the third was that we would take advantage of the economic development that would be occurring in this neighborhood to promote economic inclusion for mostly, in this particular instance, African-American businesses, African-American developers, et cetera. They would be part of the beneficiaries of all this economic activity. Well, down the road a piece, turns out that everybody had a different idea of what it meant for all families to be better off. With some folks, mostly who didn't live in the neighborhood, saying, well, they were so poorly off before, anything's got to be better than where they were, is what they meant. Whereas the folks who lived in the community meant, I want to be as well off as you are. That's what I want. Right? So there was that. There was the whole question of economic inclusion. What did that really mean at the end of the day when we had some contractors who had a lot of people of color on their rolls, but they weren't from Baltimore, they weren't African American, so we had to have that tough conversation. You know, what does that really, really mean? And mixed income communities, what we're struggling with right now. What's that really, really mean? So again, just an example of the importance of not just getting folks' heads nodding, but really pushing. What do we mean? What do we mean? Let's get clear. Also at this early stage, a mistake that often happens is you try to import wholesale somebody else's model from another city. You try to import their definition of the problem, or import their data, or import their blueprint in this work that's the cradle to career work that we're just starting up, that's where we started out. There was a lot of, well, let's just adopt the Strive model wholeheartedly, or let's just, we hired Bridgespan to help us with some things. Well, let's just do what Bridgespan said to do, and that type of, let's just bring it all in. Some folks wanted to just adopt the social genome model. Third mistake is leaving important stakeholders on the sidelines. Huge risk in any community development work that you do. With our East Baltimore work, because Casey had been funding a number of community organizations for years in that community, we were able to advocate for the inclusion of community voice in the work. And so we ended up having over 400 community meetings in the first 2 years alone just to have resident input. These were residents who were going to have to be relocated because of the development that was going to be coming to pass. So that was obviously critical to have them there. In the case of our juvenile justice work, we discovered after doing this for a few years that we had inadequately attended to the voices of parents. You don't usually think about juvenile justice kids as having parents who ought to be at the table telling you what they think, as well as youth. And finally, big mistake at this stage is rushing too quickly to sort of adopt a structure, making a bunch of governance decisions. So for example, it's important that everybody needs to get comfortable with being able to talk together, kind of exercising the muscles of collaboration till you can start to work together. In the case of what I'll call the Baltimore's Promise, which was the cradle to career work, we've actually put in place an interim structure to kind of be a holding for a while we kind of figure out in more detail what we need to accomplish. During this whole process, this early stage process, funders have this critical role to play. In some cases, we're conveners. Sometimes we're the ones who call folks to the table. Sometimes we're just a participant who's been invited. And often we're covering the cost. So what's the cost? Well, it's important to pay for things like scans of what's the current situation. It's important to pay for looking at the literature and sort of generating ideas for how one ought to proceed, paying for the data analysis. All these are things that we funders need to do. You ought to be worried. When I say you ought to be worried about something, what I really mean is you need to prepare your boards and prepare your donors, I think, for what can go wrong or what can be hard or what can be difficult at this stage, so you don't have your board or your donors or your partners pressing to have you pulled out too quickly. These early stages sometimes, they take a long time. And you're like, well, gee, we've been just talking for 6 months and nothing's happened. Sometimes that's what it takes. Now, that's all you're doing, that's a problem, but sometimes that's what it takes. You're not going to be able to control the outcome. This is a collaborative. Funders can't dictate this is what ought to happen. You're going to have to negotiate that out with your partners. You're on the verge of committing something that's really big. It's going to take a long time, so you need to be clear about that. Moving to the startup stage, this is like the initial steps that you're going to be taking. This is the time when you're really sort of starting to define the mission and define the focus of what it is you're going to work on, and you're really getting very detailed about the population that you're focused on and the population level results and the indicators that you're going to try to achieve. In the case of the school readiness example, it was that all children will show up to school ready to learn. There was a test that already existed. They said that would be the indicator, so that was pretty straightforward. In the case of the juvenile justice work, we decided with our partners that the juvenile justice system, as Faye said, is awfully large and complicated. We chose the detention decision. This is what happens when a kid's picked up for something. He has not yet had a hearing, just gets picked up. Maybe he took a car and cops arrest him. That decision of whether, until he has his hearing, where is he going to be? We saw in the 90s the detention rate, the locked in institutions before the hearing was going up and up and up and up. And we figured out that that was a decision that drove lots of other things. It was like a gear. If you could change that decision, you could change a lot of other decisions. So we focused on that as what we wanted to do. In the case of the work in East Baltimore, the first focus was actually on economic development as the engine of revitalizing the community, a biotech park. Turned out not to be a great idea, but that was the initial idea. And in the case of the Baltimore's Promise work, again, it's a fairly traditional cradle-to-career approach where you're looking at born healthy, succeeding in school with reading and math, graduating from high school, going on to post-secondary credential, and getting at a job. Well, that's going to be fun. So I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to sort of summarize. I just said I have a little more, but that's just fine. No, I can. I want to just touch, and I'm going to spend more time on the startup phase and less time on the rest of it, on the startup phase, because this really is where most of these initiatives, I think, go off track. And one of the things I want to talk about is a perspective on governance. There's a tension in all governance decisions. And the tension is between having the right level of ability to execute, right? It's almost like a power thing. You've got to have the ability to execute. And on the other hand, there's a technical expertise that comes in. And then finally, there's sort of, are you being representative? And these things are in kind of creative tension. And getting that tension right is really an important thing. Now, in the case of collective impact, I think the attempt to get this right is to have a steering committee or a large table that is representative, right? And to have a backbone organization that can execute. And to have a series of working groups that basically handle the technical side of things, right? So the working groups take on that, looking at what works and trying to sort of funnel that up to the representative group. I think that's a pretty sweet model, but be careful, because remember, these things are in tension. And as you set up your governance structure, just know that you're going to repeatedly come up against this question of, do you really represent the community, for example? Who's left out? Are you really looking at what actually works, or are you being driven more by the politics of who is an important organization and they want you to go a particular kind of a way, and so on? From the funder standpoint, what we don't do enough of is recognize that in all this startup, we don't invest enough. We don't like to pay for the infrastructure. We don't like to pay for the data analysis. We don't like to pay for all the time. So it's important that we do all of that. See how I'm skipping right through? Oh, it was 25, not 5. That's great. Okay, thanks. Thank you. And I'm going to skip all that. So let me just move to the taking action stage. And this is really when you start to move from just talking about things to actually starting to do things. This is when you have to sort of find a couple early wins that build a sense of momentum. In the case of our juvenile justice work, we discovered that in most places where we went, that they had such a poor system of literally processing the children through the system. I mean, just simple like scheduling, that we could get an early win just by doing some very straightforward process and management engineering and aligning the calendars of all these different actors. And we could cut the detention almost immediately just by doing that. That was a good example for us of an early win and some momentum. This is kind of the stage where, you know, this is very profound, but it either comes together or it doesn't. Right? Somebody's got to take that step to start making things happen. You got to see, can you produce a product? Can you actually do something differently than you otherwise would have done? Some of that's really about the technical skills that we've talked about before, but a lot of it is about the people piece, the relationship piece. So in the East Baltimore example, we recently opened the first new school in Baltimore in 25 years. Think about that. There's not been a new school in Baltimore in 25 years. We just opened one in this neighborhood with every penny of the cost of that raised through private funds. Now, in the process of getting this school built, I won't bore you with all the details, but there was storm and drang and fighting and everything back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. If we had not built the relationships that we had built with Hopkins, with the city, with the state, with the foundations, we never, ever would have gotten this thing built. So it was about the people. And the other aspect that is important in this early stage is, do you have that kind of adaptive capacity so that when things change, you can react to it? So finally, the mature stage. How do these stories end, these 4 stories that I told you? Well, they're not done yet. However, I can tell you that as of 2011, the school readiness rate in Baltimore was 78%. It had been 28%, went up to 78%. In our juvenile justice work, our average, well, I should start with saying we started with 5 jurisdictions across the country, 5 cities. We are now in 254 jurisdictions across the country. We're in 39 states. The average reduction across all of those 254 jurisdictions in the daily population in those facilities is 43%. East Baltimore is a bit of a work in progress in many, many ways. We've been at it for a long time, but we had to relocate 730 residents. Their average increase among the homeowners in their house value from where they were to where they were moved to, because we not only made them whole, we contributed to make them, allow them to move into much better housing. The average increase was $132,000 in their assets. We do surveys of them regularly. Over 85% say they're better off. They're in neighborhoods that are safer than the ones that they left. It doesn't mean they wanted to move, by the way, let's be very clear, but they report that they, in fact, are better off. We are now moving to the difficult task of repopulating the neighborhood, if you will. Neighbors who were relocated have a right to return. We now will discover if mixed income is real, whether we can make that work or not. And Baltimore's promise is brand new. So I'm going to just close now and just say that there's just no getting around the fact that these kinds of efforts are awfully tough. They are very expensive. They ask a lot from us. And they cost not only time, they cost money, they cost our political capital. So you got to ask the question, is it worth it? Is it worth it to do this? And if you apply a very simple lens, which I call the My Child test, I think you can ask that question. And it's in the case of these efforts that are focused on children, if you think about the effort that you put in for the children in your own family, you don't ask, is it worth it, right? You know that it's worth it. This month, there will be 360,000 babies born in America, not to mention the thousands more who will come here with their families trying to make a better life. 360,000 babies with lots of potential. And if you ask the question of how are those babies doing, you know, we just released a report called Race for Results, where we put together a simple index. It's on a scale of 1,000, where if a group had a score of 1,000, it would mean that they had all the opportunity in the world, they had very few barriers, or clearly on a path towards success. The highest score out of 1,000 was 776, and that was for Asian Americans. And again, subpopulations among Asian Americans are not doing as well. The score for white children was 704. The score for African American children was 345 out of 1,000. The score for Hispanic Latino children was 404. The score for Native American children was 387. Now, by 2018, just a few years from now, the majority of children in America will be children of color. By 2030, the majority of workers in America will be workers of color. So we're asked, is it worth it? You know, it is hard. It is expensive. But clearly, it's worth it. It's got to be worth it if we still believe in the American dream. It's got to be worth it if we believe in this boundless potential of those 360,000 babies that are going to be born this month. And it's got to be worth it if we still believe that we have to claim each and every one of those 360,000 babies as our very own, because they are. Thank you.